Alright, this is the last video kind of going over the independent rear suspension install in a mini truck. This specifically a 95 Nissan hardbody. This won't be the last video of the truck, but it will be kind of the last video of me just going over. It won't be the last video on the truck. It'll just be going over some of the things I should have done now that everything's kind of finished, and maybe help you to not make the same mistakes along the way. First thing, depending on your fuel cell, if I would have taken these rails and not brought them in so far, so narrow, maybe cut them back 2 inches, 2.5 inches, 3 inches, and brought them right over this upper control arm in the rear, it would have made fitting this a little bit easier, because if you saw on Instagram, I had to notch these rails out. I was originally going to mount this fuel cell on the bottom, but then the clearance in the back with the exhaust and everything else going out the back wasn't going to work. So I put it on top, and the only way to get it on top is I clearanced in these frame rails, I believe 3/4 of an inch, just over 3/4 of an inch on each side. So, if you're going to do it, take into account the fuel cell you're going to use, and figure that out beforehand. The other thing I mentioned in the other video is this piece shouldn't have been this high. What happened is, if you've ever goofed up measuring off a level, because let's say you put the level on something and the bottom of the level is sitting on it, and you measure to the top of the level, the width of your level is going to get you if you don't pay attention. And that's what I did on this. And that's why this rail is a hair higher, which kind of actually worked out with the fuel cell where it's mounted, but I didn't like the big gap I had in between here and here. In between the subframe and the bottom of the frame rail, I wanted it to be a little tighter. No big deal. As far as if I'm going to make these frame rails and sell them, these frame rails were a lot of work to do. The only thing I saw was one of the companies I was going to deal with a long time ago about mandrel bent frame rails. I noticed they don't mandrel bend frame rails anymore. They actually make these cuts on the frame rail. I'd imagine they have a laser that does it, because the cut is kind of intricate, and it basically cuts a mandrel into, removes all the material and puts a mandrel bend, so when you bend your steel down, it's got one joint in the center to weld, and you weld 2 small caps on the outside, and it has a nice smooth bend in it. So, depending on if I talk to them and see if they could basically cut rails and send them to me, and then I could kind of make a jig up, bend them up, and weld them, that's a possibility, but I really don't see that happening, because the amount of work you have to do to put something like this together, someone's either got to have a lot of money, or you got to be able to do this kind of work. And people playing with mini trucks, not the bad guys. Like, the bad guys spend money on their trucks, but when you're going more towards a street build where you want the truck to perform, a lot of guys aren't doing it. There's a few guys out there doing it. I don't remember the guy's name. A couple guys on Instagram. A few more things I got to do. I have to make the mount for the fuel pump. I have to finish these rails out, take this out, make plate to go inside so that the rails will be, because right now it's kind of like a C-channel back there, so they'll be boxed out. There'll be a brace across the back. Probably a brace or 2 in here. I don't know where I'm going to put it yet, because once the cab's back on it, you can't see now, but when I get done explaining this, I'll show you the front, what happened up there. But yeah, there'll be bars coming from the cab. I haven't decided if I'm going to come off the top of the hoop, or I'm going to come off just under the rear window on the middle of the hoop and come out. I don't know yet. I kind of like coming off the bottom and staying under the bed, because if I have bars coming off the top of the cab coming back here, driving this thing around in New York, I'm pretty sure it's probably going to be an attractant for the cops. It's going to be Florida plated anyway, because this stuff wouldn't fly for a New York inspection. Thanks to relatives in Florida. It's about the only thing Florida's good for. I'm just kidding. So, that's it for this. The coilovers are ordered. The guys at Viking were awesome. I believe he's an engineer I spoke to who got me all set up with the spring rate, everything I'm going to use. The only thing I'll have to do is I'll have to remake a lower mount because this coilover was originally made for a C5 Corvette. So it has the lower saddle mount on the bottom, which is what I need for this. And the Corvette one is a little too wide, so I will have to just make a mount for that. That won't be a big deal. But I was going to order the coilovers, and then I came out here one day and started staring at the front and pulled my SC300 front subframe down and started screwing around with the tape measure and decided I'm not going to mess around with trying to move pickup points on the Nissan stuff and get the stock control arms for the truck to work because the lowers are so long and the uppers are so short, and once you've lowered this truck to where it's at, there's so much negative camber that comes in suspension travel on this. So, like I said, after fiddling with the tape measure for a little while, I'll just stop the video and flip it around to the front. Alright, here's the front. The upper shock mounts are cut off. I did everything kind of with a bandsaw because I don't like grinding inside the shock because it's not super big inside, plus I don't like getting the metal dust all over everything. So this is the SC300 Mark IV Supra front subframe. I was supposed to go pick up 2 lower control arms, another upper control arm for the right side Friday from a junkyard, but they took the car and buried it in the back, put some cars in front of it, and then their forklift broke, so they couldn't get to the car. So whatever. Still got a little bit of work to do to cut all that stuff off, but basically what's going to happen is once all this stuff is gone, there's 2 mounting bosses up here that mount that stock subframe, and I believe I'll be able to come off with just 2 small feet mount up here, and this will come right up. The only thing I might have to do is I might have to put a pocket in here, depending on how high up this comes, to mount the rear section of the control arm. But I'll have to wait till I get the control arms because I don't know if I'm probably not going to use this back steel section. I'll get rid of it and just make a mount for the rear control arm back here because that's basically the only thing that picks up, and end up making a mount probably off the frame to mount back here just to get this thing forward and backward. So that's the plan. Also now the exhaust will be way easier to run because the torsion bars are gone. So that 4-inch bellows stainless flex pipe that has to get put in, everything should fit fine. We'll run it through here, and what I'll probably end up doing is taking a measurement for my trank mount, and now that the torsion bars are gone, get rid of this whole cross member here for the torsion bars, cut it completely out, and just have one transmission cross member that comes across that. Get rid of all that stuff. Get rid of these 2 guys. And then once that's in, then I can throw the cab back on. Well, weld it all out, get everything situated. Then the cab can go back on, start on the cage and everything else. So, running by summer. Right on. Probably not going to happen, but who cares? Then, once I get this in, forgot to mention, I don't know if I'm going to be able to use my mounts I made anymore. Because when you're working on this thing once every 3 months, when this was in North Carolina, all I was worried about was getting the engine mounted and getting everything in good to go. And then after I got it here and I started looking at it with the cab on it, I realized that if I'm going to go with rack and pinion steering on this, I'm pretty sure where the steering shaft came out of the cab, and where it would have to come down and tie into it would run right through these mounts. So, oh, and that's another positive to putting this subframe in for these control arms, is once this is in, then all I have to do is bolt a rack and pinion to the front, and that's it. It's done. I was reading a bunch of stuff that I guess the Nissan guys are doing where they're using racks, and I don't know if you know anything about bump steer, but the way you have to have your suspension set up, your upper and lower control arms, the pivot points on your rack and all that, if you get it screwed up, then ultimately when the suspension compresses or extends, it causes the wheel or tire to turn as it does. So what bump steer is when you go over a bump, it'll either toe the wheels in or toe, I think when it goes over a bump it'll toe in. But it's just something you don't want. You want very little of. So that's another nice thing about doing this is I don't have to make a mount and find a rack, and supposedly the racks they use, like I said, the pivot points on the racks aren't in geometry with the control arms, and so yeah, I have a rack on my truck, but it still handles like a fucking turd. So whatever. This will be nice. Once this is in, then I don't have to worry about anything. Just bolt the rack in it and it's finished. I have the spindles already, which I'm surprised at how small those spindles are compared to the stock Nissan or the Beltec spindles I had in this thing. So that's it. Hopefully the next video will be actually mounting this thing in and getting it ready to go.